The US and Israel have launched a major combat operation against Iran that included strikes on Tehran. The Islamic Republic has retaliated, with Israel saying it intercepted Iranian missiles. Explosions also reported in neighboring countries, including Qatar, Jordan, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. And for more on that, we're joined by Jean-Loup Samaan, Senior Research Fellow at the Middle East Institute at National University of Singapore. Jean, thank you for joining us. Now, reports saying the first wave of strikes targeted Iranian officials, including the Ayatollah. So clearly, the U.S. is gunning for a regime change.
Well, that's the big question. So far, what we know is that Donald Trump himself, in his speech, called clearly for the collapse of the regime, and he called on the Iranian people to take power. At the same time, we hear in the last hour the Israeli military saying that their own objective is not a regime change. So it's, again, unclear exactly what the end state here is. But clearly, we're in a very more ambitious operation compared to what we saw last year. So I would say that so far, it looks clearly as a regime change operation.
But what do you think is Washington's end goal here? Mr. Trump has railed against his crackdown on protesters, his nuclear program, even the seizure of the U.S. embassy back in 1979. Does the U.S. have a clear strategy on Iran?
Well, again, looking at what has been brought in terms of military assets and the speeches so far from the Trump administration, I think the strategy is mostly an air campaign, extremely intensive air campaign that will target the infrastructure, the leadership of the regime. But we're not looking at a ground invasion. Clearly, this is probably the big difference with what we saw in 2003 with the US invasion of Iraq. I think the assumption from the Trump administration is that they can lead to the collapse of the regime, and then let's say protesters, some revolutionary forces replace the current regime. But this is in many ways a big gamble, because there's no clear indication that the regime is going to just disappear, that you have a strong opposition. So that is the big question here. And probably we're going to see a long conflict. This is not a conflict for just a few days, clearly.
Do you foresee an internal uprising during active combat operations?
Well, I mean, we know that for sure there has been a protest in past weeks, past months inside Iran. The problem is that now this is putting the protesters in a very tough positions, because the protesters didn't have like a U.S. agenda, and now you're going to have a lot of divisions within the protest movement. Plus, I mean, let's keep in mind that we already had Donald Trump saying that that help was on the way. If you remember a few weeks ago, before we had negotiations between the U.S. and Iran, Donald Trump had supported the protesters before just de-escalating because of the negotiations. So I'm not sure you will have a strong trust at this stage within the protest movement inside Iran for U.S. support.
What do you make of the timing of the U.S. attack?
Well, I mean, the timing, you have, I would say, two developments. First, the fact that you had the deployment of military assets in the region at an unprecedented level in 2 decades, basically in terms of air power, naval assets. The U.S. had deployed the same level as what we saw before the war in Iraq. So we had reached a point where if there was no military action, these military assets were also going to be in jeopardy, and there was an issue of military credibility. At the same time, we saw that the negotiations between the U.S. and Iran were not going to any breakthrough, and that was predictable. I mean, clearly the Iranian regime was trying to buy time, and also very predictably, Donald Trump lost patience very quickly. So this probably explains the timing, the fact that they had the planning of the operation had been going on for a while. So both the Israelis and the Americans decided this had to be now and not longer.
Now, Iran has powerful allies like China and Russia. What are the chances that these powers will be drawn into the conflict?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't say that these are allies, these are partners. And there's a big difference in the sense that China or Russia do not entertain any pledge of solidarity to Iran. There has been military cooperation. There are some economic interests between these three countries. But apart from that, I don't honestly see either Russia or China getting into the conflict, except if there's suddenly a direct impact on, let's say, Russian or Chinese assets. But even in that, I suspect there's no appetite at this stage, just like there was no appetite last year, either from Moscow or from Beijing. So I don't think we are at this stage looking seriously at a conflict that could escalate at a global level. For sure, this is a regional conflict, as you mentioned. All the different Arab states, in particular in the Gulf, Jordan, have been targeted. So this is clearly a regional conflict, but I don't see this turning into a global conflict for sure.
Thank you for sharing your insights. That was Jean-Loup Samaan, Senior Research Fellow at the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. Thank you.